May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Well, you perhaps recognize today these words of my prayer as being the concluding lines for our psalm for today. One of my favorites. And I say them each week because they are a reminder to me that the witness I am called here to provide, the witness that any preacher is called to provide at this point, is ultimately grounded in my acknowledgement that whatever I might offer grows from my dependence on God as my foundation, as my rock, as our translation renders it. And I offer this because our Old Testament reading today from Exodus offers another manifestation of how God has served as rock, as foundation and strength for the people of Israel. The Ten Commandments, or more literally the 10 words, form the basis of Jewish law, but more importantly, they serve as a sign of God's covenant with the people of Israel. The commandments are given to Moses to be shared with the people of Israel and describe for them a vision of how the covenant that was first made with Abraham is to be lived. It comes after Israel's been led out of slavery and through the waters of the Red Sea. It comes after Israel has wandered in the wilderness and God has sustained the people with manna. And the commandments were a further gift to structure a common life and shape individual lives that are worthy of the God that has rescued them. It was a way to protect a people who were no longer slaves and open for them a path to flourishing. This is reflected in the words of our psalmist today. I think it was verse 7. I'm just going to read these again. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb. The commandments inspire joy and gratitude. The commandments were a gift that moved people deeply. They are not only a way to live, but a gift to be celebrated. And even for us here today, long separated from the days of the people of Israel's slavery, even for us here today, we have them enshrined up here on the panels of our reredos. And they're especially pertinent to us at this time of Lent, in the first part of Lent, as we remember covenant, as we celebrate covenant with God. They are especially part of our consciousness. And that's why I wanted to begin today's liturgy with the commandments, which is always an option during that penitential rite. And yet, do we really discern the principle, the spirit that these commandments intend us to fulfill? To honor God and love neighbor. That's what it all boils down to with these. Do we follow the commandments freely and appreciate their guidance? I ask this because all too often, especially in a culture such as ours, where rules and laws are often portrayed as limitations on individual freedom, that we come to experience the commandments rather as something that binds us, rather than something that is a sign of freedom, as they were for the people of Israel. Sometimes I think, and I've heard this in conversations with people, we follow the commandments out of fear of retribution rather than love of God, who's freely given them to us as gift. To follow the commandments freely, to choose the way of life to which they point, is to turn from wandering and to live in the peace of God's promise. It's not to be limited. It's to live in freedom. It's to choose. They are an enfleshment of God's promise. In the daily living, the day-to-day interactions of the people of Israel, God's promise was manifest in God's people through the way that they lived out these commandments. And we still have that today in our living out of the commandments, but there's one big difference. We have Jesus. Jesus, who is the ultimate enfleshment of God's promise, the very incarnation of God. Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the law, the end to which all the law and the prophets point. And our gospel reading today from John tells us the story of Jesus' cleansing of the temple. He's come to Jerusalem for the Passover, and upon entering the temple, he becomes enraged as he sees the money changers and the merchants in the temple court. And I should say the temple court is this area outside of the sanctuary area where the Jews would go and pray. The court was really for the Gentiles, but it was also a place of solemnity, really the only place where the Gentiles could do their worship. So he walks in, he sees this, he makes a whip of cords, he drives them out, he overturns their tables, and he's angry. We know this because there's an exclamation point after his speech, which you don't see that often in the New Testament. But he makes this whip of cords and he yells, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." This is the angry Jesus that we so seldom see. And as I read this, as I ponder it, I have to ask why. What's going on here that has so enraged him? Because what Jesus reacts to was actually quite a common practice, and it was authorized by the temple authorities. The temple tax had to be paid in temple coinage and the temple money. It couldn't be paid in the Roman coins that most people just carried around with them casually. That's why the money changers were there. And then the sacrificial animals that people brought into the temple had to be without blemish, which was quite difficult if you were traveling miles and miles to get there. And so they sold fresh animals. But nevertheless, something was wrong. And I had to keep asking myself, what is it that's going on? What is it that Jesus is, again, responding to with such fervor, with such anger? And could it be that Jesus saw the temple had lost its true purpose? The trappings of the temple were still all in place. Everything was there. The letter of the law was being fulfilled. But the spirit had been compromised. The temple's reason for being had become distorted and taken over by buyers and sellers whose trade eclipsed the real reason people came to the temple. And this was something that had happened gradually, subtly, with the consent of the temple authorities. And these are things that I think still happens for the church today as a whole. That many times we bend and follow practices enshrined in popular culture or in national identity that take us far from our reason of being. That in many cases may even deafen and blind us to where God is most present for us in our relationships. Whether it's something as simple as measuring ourselves by the size of our congregation, which we're not the only church that wants to do that, wants to grow and be big, or the size of our bank account, we're always looking, for a new pledge. We easily fall prey, the church as a whole, to measuring ourselves by standards not set by God, but by a world that has its center outside of God's holy temple. The Ten Commandments serve to call us back to discern how we are to be in right relationship right relationship to God and one another, or more broadly, right relationship to creation as a whole. In living the commandments, in praying with them, we experience God's love as manifest in our common life together. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And in relationship, in right relationship, he's here with us. He's here right now. And this is the truth that Psalm 19 tells us is more to be desired than gold. This is the truth that is sweeter than honey and drippings from the honeycomb. And it's something that all of our actions can flow from. These commandments, as we take them as a foundation, as a starting point, are something that can be prayed, something that can be discerned, something that can offer us an opening into insight as we seek to live into God's vision for us. And as I was preparing for this, I was looking at a lot of different translations of various things, and one of them I kept coming back to was a translation of our psalm. And I want to close by sharing again the psalmist's praise of the law, because I think it gives us some insight into how we are called to use the commandments to discern, to live more fully. Because this translation offers a more active verse. It tries to make clear how God's law always calls us to turn back to him. God's perfect law revives the soul. God's stable rule guides the simple. God's just demands delight the heart. God's clear commands sharpen vision. God's faultless decrees stand forever. God's right judgments keep their truth. Let us celebrate the gift that God has given us in the commandments. Let us celebrate the gift that God gives us in covenant, and always seek to discern, to live as fully as we can into the law as it is presented to us, not just in letter, but in spirit, in coming together and recognizing that God is here right now with us in this place as we pray together. Amen.